Well, welcome to the Aviation Insurance Podcast, where we like to look at issues from the past, issues from the present, and we like really to look forward into the future. And we look at aspects of aviation insurance, and we looked at safety. And I want to bring a guest who's got some really interesting work that he's doing that's a different angle than we looked at before. And so today I'm excited to bring on as our guest Don Berchoff, who is the CEO of TruWeather Solutions, who's going to talk a little bit about how weather and climate, can affect risk management and aircraft and drone operations. And so with that, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, Tim, thanks for having me. I think this is a really good conversation at the right time.
Absolutely, Don. So tell us kind of the high-level journey of where you got started getting into the industry and kind of how you became the CEO of TruWeather Solutions today.
Well, my journey started back when I was 7 years old. I really am a weather geek. I think there's a lot of closet weather geeks out there, a lot of aviators that are closet weather geeks. It's a curiosity about something that you can't forecast and trying to figure out how you could do it better, right? And so by the time I went to school, I went to get my degree in meteorology in New York at Oneonta. And then I decided to join the Air Force, and I spent 24 years in the Air Force practicing this trade. I was lucky in that this was in the 1980s, and I actually was an aircrew meteorologist. So I had about 300 hours flying in EC-135s, KC-10s, basically dragging fighters overseas for air refueling, and really knowing where that alternate was going to be if they couldn't hit the boom. So I got to fly in what I forecasted, and I got to fly with the pilots that, sometimes we got surprised by what we hit. There's no better education, right? Because I really understood how weather impacted every aspect of airmanship. And from there, I built big regional weather centers. I innovated with Air Mobility Command, which is the main airline for the Air Force, right? We were at Scott Air Force Base. We were flying 100,000 missions a year. We didn't have a lot of regularly scheduled flights to the same places all the time. Some places we never even had weather data, like in Afghanistan. So it really, showed me how weather data was being used in risk management in order to affect the mission. And, we had to get bombs on target. We had to, get the ISR asset to see the bad guy. Was there clouds going to block that, right? Were we going to be able to even get the drones up later on? And so this is just totally built my approach to weather and aviation and logistics around a risk management framework. And I think what really put the cherry on the top of the cake was my last assignment. I ran an Air Force base. I ran Manas Air Base in Central Asia, which was the main staging base into Afghanistan. And I was the weather guy, but I wasn't even in charge of weather, although I kind of was. And then I made the decisions about how aircraft were going to be, used in different types of conditions. So really strong background in bringing all this together. Then I went to the Weather Service. I was a senior executive, and I was the science and technology director for 4 years. And that's where I got to see all this technology we're not using today in aviation. Our aviation system is so 20th century. And, when I saw that and I decided to go out and start this business, it was really about unlocking the power of science and technology that has not gotten out into operational use. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and we could get into all that, but I never looked back. I always looked forward. And when I saw the drone industry and the AAM industry coming about in 2017, I said, that's the best business case we've ever had for microweather. And so all the hurdles in getting better weather infrastructure out there, all the hurdles in getting better technology, it really came down to a business model and a business case. And that's what we built. We built a company that is going to fill these gaps where today we don't have data, which is risk to aircraft. It's risk to helicopter operators. It's risk to GA. But we've lived with that risk because we've had a pilot on board, which is our best weather sensor. Now you're going to remove the pilot and you're going to hit the same unknown, undetectable weather events that surprise us today. And now you're not going to have that heuristics on board. So we want to backfill that with physical and digital technology that's going to help, eliminate the risk or reduce the risk of losing the best sensor on the aircraft.
Yeah, it's always interesting, the story of where people got into this business, and especially on these innovative companies, to where they came, because it really kind of helps fill in the gap, or create some understanding about where you're at. And so that in mind, your company provides comprehensive low altitude weather solutions to improve safety and efficiency in the scaling drone and air taxi industry. So just explain to us a little bit more about exactly what you do in your current company and role.
Well, we're trying to solve a really big problem that's existed since we started flying, and we haven't really solved it yet. And that's, how do we get better understanding of the low altitude environment, of what's really happening? So if you think about it today, the only place we really measure weather is at airports. And, we do have aircraft flying and collecting data, but they're flying mostly above the weather or above the low altitude. And those that are flying the low altitude don't have the automated means to report weather, right? So the only places we're really getting good wind data, good ceiling, cloud height data, good visibility data is at the airports in the low altitude. We only do 2 balloon launches a day to get weather above ground level. Everything else between airports, no measurements. Now we have models that are doing the best they can to take this very limited data set and try to apply physics and all kinds of things to say, this is what we think it's looking like here. But the problem is when you get to things like ceiling and visibility, they're very localized. If they're between an airport, you may never know they're there. You won't know they're there. And so when people talk about doing machine learning and improving forecasts, yes, you could do machine learning, but you have to have a good historical data set to do that. And you only could do good weather machine learning where you have a good historical data set. And if anyone's telling you that we're using machine learning to improve cloud forecasts and ceilings between airports, really, they don't have a historical data set to do that. They're using an analysis of what we thought was happening as their initial data set. So errors are already being imposed. So TruWeather said this is not acceptable when you have to fly VFR, right? Or in the case of winds, the same problem. We don't measure winds above ground level. So what's really happening? We see days where the winds could be off 30% from the model. And I think everyone can relate to this. It doesn't happen every day. And our modeling is amazing if you consider how little we have that we're using. But I'm not satisfied, because we have the science and the technology to get this infrastructure out to close that gap and to collect this data that's going to make weather more certain. And you won't have to be surprised. And the uncertainty is really the problem, because if you don't know and you're a drone operator flying 70 miles without a pilot on board, or the remote operator is flying 1,000 miles away from where the drone's flying, and they're not even waking up in the same place that the drone is living, or you're going to fly one pilot to many drones, or you're going to go fully automated and autonomous without any human looking at it. You need a better understanding of that uncertainty. Otherwise, you're going to wind up canceling missions you could fly. And that's really the basis of our premise, is that when I was in the Air Force, I demonstrated at Air Mobility Command, they were flying 100,000 missions a year. They were having a 5% weather delay rate. I was watching how business was being done, and I realized quickly that we could cut that back in half without even getting new data. It was just how people use data. People get into their habits of how they use information. And a lot of people think they're weather people, and because they see it on the internet, they think they're even more of a weather person. But what you got to remember, what you're seeing on the internet is not real necessarily. It's a model of what we think is happening. That's why a meteorologist is still important, because we can actually infer things without having real data. But the issue is that at the TACC, the Tank Aircraft Control Center, I went to the 2-star General Woolley, and I said, look, if we change the way we're doing planning and dispatching, I think I could get you back half of that loss. And he was game, and we did it. And we've set up a risk management framework that included the dispatchers and the planners. And we cut the delays in 1 year in half. We cut them from 5,000 to 1,800 without any new data. We saved the Air Force $200 million. It was financially validated because we were nominated for the Chief of Staff Team Excellence Award. So what I've done is taken everything I learned there, and I'm now we were using spreadsheets back then, and we didn't have tools we have today. What we're doing is automating this process, and we're adding more data now through infrastructure, and that should help reduce the uncertainty, which will get most drone pilots more flight time if they have real data. And that's the business case we're trying to make. And we think we can get them a 4-to-1 return on investment, and they could be safer, and they could have less risk.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're looking at the models, the data to reduce downtime, and obviously flying into weather-related issues. I don't know if you're tracking it, but do you track or have any idea what weather-related drone and or aircraft incidents you find to be most prevalent today as it relates to weather?
Well, it's interesting. If you look, I don't have all the stats off the top of my head, but I did do a LinkedIn post on this maybe 6 months ago. If you look at the accident investigations of manned crewed aircraft, what you'll find is a very small percentage are really weather is the primary cause or factor. But when you look at the contributing factors, weather is like 70% of the time a contributing factor, right? So if you look at what happened, let's just say in Minneapolis, was it Minneapolis or Toronto? If you look at what happened in Toronto, it was no doubt that, that was some kind of, I should say that. I'm not a professional expert, but there's little doubt that the pilot, there were some things they did that they weren't prepared for the situation they were facing. Now, it happened to be a very gusty day for winds. And I haven't seen the final report, but I bet you, wind gusts had to be a contributing factor in causing some of the miscalculations that were made. What I see is a lot of time we underplay weather as the factor because the human is supposed to get out of that problem. But now, if you don't have the pilot on the aircraft and they're flying a drone 1,000 miles away from where they are, and they really aren't in the cockpit, how are they going to know what's really happening? Our systems aren't good enough for that. So can you really blame them if they run into unexpected or undetectable weather? And that's one of the debates I'm having with the FAA, because I think weather is rising into a hazard and a risk itself, because if you don't have a pilot on board, who's going to manage that risk, right? The only way you can manage it is by having better data. So I think where we're going is what we're seeing with drones, and what we're seeing, and a lot of these, crewed aircraft, it's flying into IMC conditions, like helicopters that don't expect it and run into a power line. It's a GA here in Montgomery County that went into a power line at an airport due to running into unexpected IMC conditions. Sometimes it's wind shear, wind gusts. It depends, right? But on drones and air taxis, what we are seeing is that, they're not, they're smaller, they're lighter, they're battery powered, which means now, you have less energy available to deal with things at your landing point, because now you're landing and you're not lighter like you used to be with fuel. Now you're the same weight and you have less power. And these issues are going to start coming to roost, especially in urban areas where winds are not, we don't measure them. Like, we don't know what the winds are at a vertiport, really, unless you have an ASOS there or a measurement. And a lot of heliports and even, regional airports, I would say GA airports don't even have weather measurement equipment. And so, this is going to be a problem that's going to increase their uncertainty. And so what we're seeing right now is about a 40% cancellation rate due to weather, but weather's not the reason. Sometimes, about half the time, it's uncertainty, and using the nearest METAR that doesn't apply to the location they're flying. So this is what I'm trying to get my head around, working with industry and trying to, highlight that this is an issue that's going to start roosting. And it's going to, we've proven that better data and better management of weather risk can get you more flight time if your processes are there and the data's there.
Yeah, and you talked a little about the risk management approach that you're working on. How does the use of your technologies impact the risk management approach of operators using them today?
Well, I'll give you an example. We have some drone delivery companies today that have to fly on a schedule in order to make money. there are, there are longer range drone operators that can fly BVLOS that are using certain rules that allow them to stay near the obstruction that they're measuring and things like that. But, they could time that. Those inspections don't have to happen that moment. If there's risk, they could just cancel it. And then the cost is just on the people you put out there, and they're not working the things you expect them to work that day. But if you're talking about delivery of packages or some kind of like drone as a first responder, public safety, where you're starting to depend on drones to actually take the place of human manpower that was doing things in the past, you can't just sit on the ground in uncertain conditions. You really, I know the public safety is going to push the line, and they should, right? Because the risk difference is, somebody's life versus losing a drone, right? But these drone delivery companies, what they're trapped with right now is they got to use the nearest METAR, and the nearest METAR could be 10 miles away. And, anybody who's been on a runway knows, and I was at Kunsan for a year, and I used to get beat up by the wing commander because my observer was calling, unlimited visibility. And at the approach end of the runway, they couldn't come in and see the runway, and they're diverting. So, weather's very local. And I always tell people, they always ask me, "Oh, Don, how relevant is an observation?" I go, "Well, it depends," right? I said on a nice homogeneous weather day where things are nice, it's relevant for more miles. But unfortunately, the days when it matters are the days when you have low ceiling and clouds and rain showers and things. It could be very localized, and it may not be valid halfway down the runway it was measured from. So, how do you manage that risk and do it in a way that's still going to have economics where you can make money, right? And I think that's the thing that's the juxtaposition of what we're trying to get our head around. How do we do it affordably? The ASOSs, they're not affordable. They cost $250,000 to $1 million or more, and you can't put those at a vertiport or a heliport. The reason, today our choice in a heliport is a windsock or an ASOS. That doesn't sound like a choice to me. So one of the things I've done is I've been working with ASTM and the FAA. We came up with a new weather standard that's been published, and you guys can look at this. It's an ASTM weather standard. It was published in January 24. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow the use of other types of weather sources in aviation decisions for Part 135, Part 91, drone operations AAM. And it's going to drive the cost down. And, there's some really good sensors out there that could give you a ceiling of visibility, all the things you need at a heliport or vertiport for, $40,000. And now all of a sudden that changes the whole the economics, right? And because now if I'm going to give you a ceiling height for someplace you never had one before, and you've canceled medevac missions in the past because you weren't sure what the ceiling was at the airport, now you can fly. And so I think that's kind of where we have to go. We got to get them more data so they can reduce their risk and their uncertainty and make the money they need in order to be, a business that's scaling and economic for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. So, I know you're not in the aviation insurance business, but how would you, to the best of your judgment, how do you think aviation insurers can best use this information to help improve safety and reduce losses from their perspective?
Well, again, I'm not going to tell you that I'm just a layman when it comes to insurance. I understand risk. Weather's a risk business. I have to understand it. But I don't understand what an insurance company needs in order to make their actuary, work for them. And what I will tell you is that when I look at what we're doing with vehicles now and customizing insurance by driver more than by, actuaries in the past, I think we could do the same thing with pilots. I think, personally, I think if there's a way to understand what tools that pilot's using and are they paying a little extra for those tools, but that gives them that greater certainty in reducing their risk. Is it a good day they're trying to fly? Is it a marginal day? Is it a bad day? I believe that once we get better low altitude weather information, there'll be areas of the country like the cell phone industry. Remember how the cell phone industry came out? We're not going to have coverage everywhere on low altitude. And what I'm going to tell you is the government can't afford to pay for this. I know this because I was in the government. And I think now, I told people in 2010 the government wouldn't pay for this. Now I think I don't even have to say that anymore because we're watching what's going on. Everything's becoming more privatized, right? Everyone has gotten used to aviation weather coming from the government. That's been good and it's been bad. It's been good because you have to pay for it. It's been bad because it hasn't really improved with the technology and it's costing you money. Free is costing you money, right? But we've never been able to make that business case that we have to get more sensors out there and that you may pay for that, but it's going to be better for you. So the question becomes, I'm trying to drive an infrastructure as a service concept across the weather industry for aviation where we say, look, we could deploy infrastructure if we can get enough customers buying that. We don't have to go to the government for money. We could set up a service model that will drive improvements in low altitude weather. And as far as I'm concerned, nobody has to use it if they don't want to, right? That's their risk decision. So I'm not saying you have to use it, but what I'm saying is I've been working with the ASTM and the FAA to give you an option to use it. And that option should pay dividends to the user. And how does the insurance company then benefit from having that data in these areas? And how could they change their approach to, risk a flight against individual people who are flying and the type of aircraft they're flying and what kind of risk they're taking? Whether it's flying on a day where you could get information, the insurance company can say, hey, you're flying on a marginal risk day. I'm going to increase your rate a little bit. And then, by the way, I have this data now that you could be using to reduce your risk. And how do we, more customize this industry and to be supportive of each other because we need to get better weather data out there. And how do we drive the market to say, yeah, this is a great idea. And it could serve both, the insurance industry, the economics of the business, and the safety.
Yeah, no, that's very good. I just, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about, the fact that, a number of aviation insurers have said, have shared that, the weather losses, not just, flight related contributing factors, but like ground, hail, wind, these type of losses have really increased in recent years. What would you attribute to that potentially from your best perspective?
Well, look, I'm a scientist. I'm not a politician. I want to make that clear.
Which we appreciate for sure.
Right. And again, science is under attack a little bit right now because the narrative doesn't work for other people. Right. And that's the issue. There's no doubt the climate's warming. I mean, anybody who's taken a basic course in physics knows that greenhouse effect is real. That's why farmers, put greenhouses out. Right. And the atmosphere operates the same way. And so it is warming up. Now, we can argue about whether it's natural causes or man-made, and I don't have to get there because the facts are it's warming up, right? So when you warm the climate up, you're going to have more extreme weather because it's the differences in air masses that cause hail, cause bigger hail, it cause more updrafts, it cause, Now, there'll be some people who argue that, well, we just have more reporting now. In the past, it used to fall in the field and no one knew about it. Well, we're smart enough to know that. We actually normalize that stuff, as scientists. And, we there is more, hazardous weather and impactful weather. So I think, and that's not going to change whether, it doesn't matter what our politicians do. It is what it is, right? So what we need to do is be aware of that. The second thing is we've got to do better at predicting it so we can maybe get people to do the right things to mitigate the impacts, whether it's an aircraft operator. Hey, look, when I was in the Air Force, the scariest job I had was, hey, Don, is that hail going to hit the base? We had billions of dollars of aircraft on the runway. All right. So I know this problem. I was the guy that, well, you sure we have to evacuate, Don? Well, no, I'm not telling you have to do anything. I'm going to tell you there's a 3% chance that that hailstorm is going to hit here and do damage to the aircraft. You make the decision on whether you want to evacuate, right? And I had these arguments with colonels, that were wing commanders when I was a captain. And I just said, look, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just telling you the risk and you decide, right? And of course, 80% of the time it didn't hit, right? And didn't do damage. But then you get that one event where every aircraft is damaged. It costs, they're all out of the inventory now. It costs $1 billion to fix everything. And, it's that high risk, high consequence event. So I understand this. And what I'm trying to do is figure out how can we help people make better decisions about that. And whether that's better prediction, which requires better data, you can't deny it. I'm sorry, I don't care what anybody says, you need data. Or it's better decision tools that take that data and really make it useful for the kinds of things that you care about as an insurance company, right? We're not good at that. I mean, we're not even close to being good at translating this stuff into something that I consider is even halfway to where it needs to be in order to make those decisions. A lot of people are biased, right? Humans make decisions, they're biased, right? Oh, they said that, Don said that 5 times before. This time I'm not going to do it. And then it happens, right? So, how do you in the insurance business know better than anyone else? You need a stable process, right? To be able to do actuary. So I'm just trying to help you guys where I can.
Absolutely. And, part of our audience are just aviators or in the aviation business, but a lot of our audience also is in the aviation insurance business. But the common thing is, even a lot of the folks in aviation insurance, from brokers to underwriters to claims, they're all aviators. And so weather and aviation weather is always a big deal, whether it's from the business perspective or just from the passion of aviation. And so that's why all this is just really interesting, not only from a risk mitigation perspective, but from aviation piloting and aviation safety. So, and given that, I know we could talk for days and days on the issue. So I'll just kind of try to bring this high level overview of kind of these new technology and what you're doing to a close. Just saying, is there anything or any questions I should have asked but didn't, or do you have any closing thoughts that you would share with our audience?
Yeah, I think what I want the audience to know is that what they've gotten used to in the weather aviation industry, we haven't updated. The last time we deployed a new weather measurement capability for aviation that was transformational or, technologically much superior was the weather radar, Doppler weather radar in 1992. So it's been, I'm telling you the truth. It's been 32 years, right? And we are working on LiDAR technology. We're working on all kinds of lower cost, we call it SWAP, right? Lower cost ways to crowdsource data, take advantage of these new technologies. No criticism to the government. They just couldn't move fast enough to deal with it, right? So this is why we set up this company. We're supporting the government as a, third-party approach. And it's not just TruWeather. I'm hoping that we really ignite a whole industry here that's doing this in weather to support this. So don't be satisfied with what you have, and don't be thinking you have to make an excuse for not having better because you've in the past been able to get around it. You got around it. And I take my hat off to people, right? How many horror stories do I hear people alive to tell me? But what I'm going to tell you is this, is that when you remove the pilot from the aircraft, everything changes. You don't have all those heuristics. You got to kind of blank your mind and say, all right, I got to make believe now. I know nothing about weather. I don't have 4,000 hours flying over that hill. I don't know what the turbulence is like on the other side, even though the weather guy never told me it was there, but I knew it would be there. And when he briefed me, I smiled and go, oh yeah, you don't know, weather guy. I know it's going to be there. That's gone. And so we need to think about this as a clean slate and make sure that we're not holding back, this progress of getting the new technology out because people are afraid that it's going to drive costs up. No, it's going to help drive costs down. And I think, it's going to make everybody economically more profitable because today you're sitting on the ground 30% of the time when you could fly. How many people have said that to you? Oh, I could have flown today. The weather guy was wrong. Well, let's take that to heart. I'm just going to try to help you solve that now so you don't have to complain about it anymore. So let's go on this journey together.
Yeah. Yep. Safety, everyone getting to where they want to go safely is obviously the common objective for everyone involved. And we appreciate your efforts in doing so. So Don, just thank you again for giving us your time today and stepping away to share what you're doing, how you're trying to serve, aviation and all the things you've done to gain this expertise in weather, and for being just a great guest here on the podcast. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim, for having me. Appreciate the forum.
Absolutely. Well, that's all for this episode. Join us again next time as we continue navigating the waypoints in aviation insurance. Until then, enjoy clear skies and unlimited visibility.
Thanks for listening to the Aviation Insurance Podcast. If you found this episode of value, please share it with someone who would benefit from this information. Don't forget to subscribe in your podcast player so you don't miss any new episodes, and to help our show have more impact. This episode is brought to you by Aviation Insurance Solutions, your flight plan for navigating the turbulence of aviation insurance. For more information, visit arisinsurance.com. That is www.aerisinsurance.com. Disclaimer: these episodes are for educational purposes only, and due to the changing regulatory and legal nature of the business, some information may change over time. Having a well-educated and experienced aviation insurance broker on your team is an absolute requirement to success in business and for managing your aircraft and aviation business risks.